Hey guys, what's up? And I right now is July 10th, but when I'm uploading this it's probably July 13th. It's going to be the last album review before I go to Europe and go and see the world basically. So, in order to end with a bang, I decided to do a review on the very, very famous neutral milk hotels in the Aeroplane over the sea. And yes, I have already finished my M&M review series. I've done a very brief review of U2's War last time, and I will also do another review of an old album, like someday in the future, Nas Illmatic, that is. But right now, I'm gonna stick to this album. So, this album, the first thing that comes to your mind if you are very familiar with modern music is that this album has a very ridiculous and infamous reputation. Not that it's bad or anything, but there are so many people in the music community right now, not the mainstream, but the more hipster side of our music community, are mocking this album and making jokes, mountains and mountains of jokes out of this album, simply because of the abstract and surreal lyrics and themes throughout the album. But despite that, I love this album so much. I have to do a review about it. And by the way, this is also one of the earlier albums that I have discovered in my lifetime when I was going into music in general. So, yes, it's been a while. It's been a while. So, Neutral Milk Hotel is an indie folk band formed in Louisiana, USA. And their discography is extremely short. They only released 2 studio albums, in fact. And still, with such a short discography, they managed to release such a classic and flawless album. So, In the Aeroplane Over the Sea is released in the year 1998, which is like 4 years before I was born. And this album, despite the fact that Neutral Milk Hotel wasn't like a crazy famous band, this album was celebrated everywhere in the music community, and everyone was going nuts about this album. So, I gave it a listen, and at first I wasn't too impressed with the album, but the more I listen to it, the more I love it. And now I just love it so much. This album sounds extremely bold and loud and passionate, and it has a great seamless fusion of noise rock and psych rock and folk music from Scotland, USA, Eastern Europe, and it also has a dash of grunge vibe on this album as well, because hey, it's the 90s and we have bands like Nirvana out there. Of course, we have a little grunge in this album, but the arrangements on this album is also even more surprisingly epic and colorful and sweet, and there are so many instruments being used in this album. Saws, horns, accordions, strings, bagpipes even, and of course you have the basics, the guitars, which are very sweet and springy. We have the bass guitars, which are very bass boosted and loud and heavy. What's even heavier is the drums. They are booming, loud, and we also have the vocals, which are very nasal and young and innocent and naive, and the vocalist is Jeff Mangum, also the leader of the band, the genius behind. So yeah, with all these instruments exploding in your face, it feels very aggressive and even painful, but at the same time it feels very beautiful and soft and tender. And if you are more artistically sensitive, maybe, you will definitely feel this wall of sadness, this very thick wall of sadness and pain behind this facade of happiness on this album, which is extremely magical and very, very vivid and in your face. And this album also feels like a concept album, although it's so hard to tangle, it's so hard to comprehend, but it feels like there is a World War II concept running throughout the album in a very indirect way, so it really makes the theme even more disturbing and unsettling. And speaking of disturbing, the lyrics on this album is extremely disturbing, and the imagery that the lyrics depict are very dark and grim and strange and surreal. It's crazy. It's really hard to comprehend, really. You know, a boy in Spain playing the pianos, which is filled with flames. Semen stained the mountaintops. That is a famous line. Two-headed boys, ghosts, tomatoes, radio wires. And although it may sound a little nonsensical, yet it is so emotionally impactful and powerful. It's kind of shocking. And one of the reasons why it's so emotionally impactful is because that this album explores the themes of death, war, love, and God in such a surreal and abstract way, but yet so realistic at the same time, so in front of you. It's really strange. And maybe the instrumentations are kind of simple, the chords are kind of simple, but because of this simplicity, this album is extremely beautiful, extremely sweet, but yet so powerful. And this album also stays to its core with its folky and milky sound. The folk music that comes out of this album isn't the hollow, the very washed out folk music, but instead it's very solid, it's very milky, so milky, it's unsettling. The album starts off with King of Carrot Flowers Part 1, which is an amazing album opener. It feels like opening a book.
When you were young, you were the king of carrot flowers, and how you built the tower tumbling through the trees, in holy rattlesnakes that fell all around your feet.
And it's just a very light-hearted start that's really warm, that's really heartwarming and optimistic and uplifting. It really makes you feel kind of happy at first, but when you go into the lyrics, you realize it kind of depicts family violence and how mom sticks a fork on dad's shoulders and dad dreams of all the different ways he dies. It's violence depicted in such an animated and surreal way. It's kind of strange and simply strange, really. And then we have King of Carrot Flowers Part 2 and 3, which are two same tracks. Yeah, one is a individual track, and then 2 and 3 is also one track. And of course, on King of Carrot Flowers Part 2, we have the famous line, "I love you, Jesus Christ," which is a very loud and bold and ballsy statement, given that faith is a very questionable thing nowadays. And then it busts into Part 3, which is very speedy and distorted. It's very thrilling, and it's very distorted. It's kind of unsettling. Again, before I go into this album, I was told by various websites that this album is one of the saddest albums ever. And when I went into this album, it doesn't feel quite sad. So when I hear all of these thrilling noises, it's really strange and unsettling. I don't know when is it going to be sad, when is it going to be dark. It sounds like it's about to burst, but then it kind of suppresses itself a little bit. Anyway, the third track is the title track, In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, which is easily the catchiest and the sweetest track in the entire album. Yet the lyrics are really, really dark. And one day we will die, and our ashes will fly on
the aeroplane over the sea. But for now we are young, let us lay in the sun and count every beautiful thing we can see. Love to be.
And there are also a lot of weird and strange and random Anne Frank references in the lyrics. Jeff Mangum never really confirmed that these lyrics are specifically about Anne Frank, but it's definitely referring to Anne Frank in a lot of ways. So it's even stranger. It makes the theme even more strange and somewhat dark and unsettling. And then we have Two-Headed Boy, which is an extremely stripped back acoustic track, but despite the fact that it's a very quiet track, it's a bit grungy and very much fiery and very gloomy as well, and in a raging way even. So again, in the surface it may sound quiet and peaceful, but in the back something's wrong, you can tell. And then we have The Fool, which is a little bit over 1 minute long, and it has these marching drums and dejected trumpets and horns, but it's really depressing and cold-blooded. It kind of sounds like a funeral brass band. And then we have Holland 1945, which is a very explosive and furious and uplifting, speedy track, and very much rock-oriented. And the chorus, it kind of reminds me of 90s sitcom TV show theme songs. But again, it sounds so uplifting, it's weirding me out a little bit, which is a good thing, of course. And then we have Communist Daughter, which contrasts the previous track, Holland 1945, a lot, because it becomes super quiet and sad all of a sudden, but not like straight up directly sad, but more like secretly and indirectly sad. It sounds very painful as well. It sounds like the aftermath of a very explosive and tragic maniac incident, if you know what I mean. But yet, it sounds kind of sweet. And then, of course, we have the famous line, "Semen stains the mountaintops," which is, I don't know what does this line mean, to be honest, but, to me, it sounds like Jeff Mangum is trying to depict sexual violence, but in a very soulful and broken way. So, it's very surreal, yet so painful. And there are also a lot of, strange and dark and broken and dystopian imageries on this track, lyrics as well, such as cars careening from the clouds and bridges that turns and twists. And the next track is "Oh Comely," which is 8 minutes long, surprisingly, and this is basically a very heavy and painful acoustic track that again has a very obvious grunge vibe, and again the lyrics are even more disturbing. We're gonna fold and freeze together and let your skin blend itself with mine. It's very body horror like. And then we have "Ghost," which is another really sweet and explosive track, literally a very large and bold and passionate explosion of instrumentals, of loud booming drums, heavy bass, and crazy doodly bagpipes. And it sounds extremely bass boosted in a very disturbing way. And for Communist Daughter, "Oh Comely," and "Ghost," we also have these very abrupt intros. Not real intros, but it sounds like the very last instrumental part of the previous track is somehow pushed over to the next track for like the first half a second. It's very abrupt, and again, it kind of weirded me out, because going into this album, I was expecting something dark and sad and monstrous even. So hearing something so abrupt and incomprehensible, I was a bit freaked out, I guess. And then we have the Untitled track, which is literally titled Untitled. And again, it's about 1 minute long. It's kind of like an interlude, and it has this very loud and poppy beat. It's again very passionate, very explosive. But I guess this is probably the weakest track on the entire album. But then this album ends off suddenly with Two-Headed Boy Part 2. Where did it come from? Where did it creep out and decide to end off this album? And, wow, the introduction to this track is very much suspenseful, because, again, I was expecting something sad and dark and scary to happen on this album, and it's the last track, and, you know, it was the first time that I listened to this album, like 2 years ago, and when I first listened to it, I was like, oh wait, something's gonna happen, isn't it? And I said that to myself because of the very ghoulish and haunting ambient intro to this track. It's very distorted. It's very stale. But then it kind of transitions into another very dejected but yet sweet ballad that acts as a perfect closer to the entire album, and it also kind of echoes the starter of the album, King of Carrot Flowers Part 1.
Daddy, please hear this song that I sing. In your heart there's a spark that just screams for a lover to bring.
And it's just a very beautiful and haunting ending to the album. And overall, I am really impressed with the album, not gonna lie. There are a lot of tension building and releasing on this album, a lot of hot and cold, a lot of highs and lows, and a lot of suppressed and sad and dejected moments, yet at the same time very aggressive and explosive and passionate. It's so numb, somehow. But yet this album is very consistent, very sonically consistent, and very solid as well. And throughout the album, it still feels very surreal and abstract and artistic, of course, and yet very ambitious and bold. And yes, this album brings so much emotions, so many emotions. It can be very exciting and depressing at the same time, and in a very painful way, even. So, yes, this album, wow. And, yeah, I listened to this album once again, last night, and damn, I love it so much. It really grows on you, trust me. But, you know, you don't have to like this album. It's your choice, but I do. The worst is the Untitled track. I'm sorry, and the best is, hard pick, but the title track is probably my favorite. I'm giving Neutral Milk Hotels in the Aeroplane Over the Sea. That's it. A 10 out of 10. Perfect score. Wow, you didn't see that coming, do you? This is the fourth album that I have given a 10. You know, first being Radiohead's OK Computer, then it's Eminem's Marshall Mathers LP, and Eminem's The Eminem Show, and then this. But still, I am yet to give a 10, a perfect score, to a modern album, like right now, in 2018. But, you know, whatever the case may be, I love this album so much. And have you listened to this album? From 1 to 10, how much you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more.